with the School of Inclusive and Special Education at DCU Institute of Education, where she specializes in the area of deaf education. Dr. Matthews completed her MA in Deaf Education at Gallaudet University, Washington, D.C., and her PhD with Maynooth University. Previously, she was the coordinator of the Deaf Education Center in Cabra, Dublin, and sat on the board of management of Holy Family School for the Deaf in Cabra. Elizabeth is the project lead for Socio-Emotional Development in Deaf Children Project, the Irish Sign Language STEM Glossary Project, the Bachelor of Education ISL Pathway, along with a number of other projects for ISL and deaf people. Her research publications include work on power in the deaf education system, literacy and deafness, the socio-emotional development of deaf children, life skills development in vulnerable deaf adults, and teacher self-efficacy. So the title of her presentation is Socio-Emotional Development in Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children in Ireland, Findings from a Quantitative Study. There is a considerable international evidence showing that the rates of socio-emotional difficulties are higher in deaf and hard of hearing children compared to their hearing peers. So this presentation reports findings on the first large study on socio-emotional outcomes for deaf and hard of hearing children in the Republic of Ireland. Data was collected on 113 children from their parents and teachers. Findings show that rates of socio-emotional difficulties are in line with international findings and are considerably higher than that of hearing children in Ireland. So I give the floor now to Dr. Elizabeth Matthews.
Thank you, Lucia. I don't know if I need to do any introduction or if you just want to go ahead with the presentation, but just to say that it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for all of the organising that has gone on in the background. I know it's a hard task to get a series like this set up, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be the first in the seminar series. So I think I can just pass over to Cormac is dealing with the logistics of pressing play for us there.
Hello and good evening to everyone, and thanks so much for coming to my presentation. I'm sure most of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Matthews, and I'm a lecturer in DCU's School of Inclusive and Special Education. The topic I'll be presenting on is Socio-Emotional Development in Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children in Ireland, Findings from a Quantitative Study. Within the presentation, I will cover the following. Firstly, what did we already know about socio-emotional development before this study? Then, how data collection took place during the study, what results we found, then the implications of these results and why they're important, and finally, next steps. Okay, so what are socio-emotional skills? Well, there are many of them, and they are vital for our everyday life. They include being able to form and maintain friendships, being able to self-regulate, understanding our own emotions and how to express them, how to resolve difficulties and conflicts with others when they arise, knowing what behavior is appropriate. It's important to note here that that doesn't always mean good behavior. In some situations, it is appropriate to be angry or sad, for instance. And lastly, interpersonal relationships, dealing with other individuals every day, not just those deeper relationships with friends and family, but also those situations that come up when, for example, you need to know how to interact with someone that may need help with something. So these skills cover a wide range of areas, Prior to beginning the study, there was plenty of international research relating to deaf and hard of hearing children's socio-emotional development. The key results from this research were as follows. Firstly, there is much evidence to show that there are higher rates of socio-emotional difficulty among deaf and hard of hearing children compared to their hearing peers. And the research cited here on screen under this first point highlights this disparity. Next, in terms of prevalence of these difficulties among deaf and hard of hearing children, there seems to be a rate of about 35 to 40% of these children presenting with such difficulties. Some of the literature gives figures slightly above or below this, but we are talking roughly about a 35 to 40% prevalence rate. Some studies show this figure represents a prevalence twice as high as that among hearing children, while others give a figure of 3 times higher than hearing children. Thirdly, we know from this evidence that the kinds of socio-emotional problems that deaf and hard of hearing children experience are numerous and multifaceted. These problems can often be emotional or behavioral, or linked to peer relationships, or hyperactivity, and so on. This means that young deaf and hard of hearing children often have many and varying problems in this area. We also know that when deaf and hard of hearing children have socio-emotional problems, they impact more on their day-to-day lives. Hearing children with these problems can often get through everyday situations in family and school environments, or have difficulties in school, say, but manage well at home, or vice versa. However, deaf and hard of hearing children are more severely impacted in everyday life at home, in school, within their friendships, among peers, and in other domains. Thus, socio-emotional problems have a more serious effect on everyday life for deaf and hard of hearing children. We know as well that we need a particular focus on peer problems among deaf and hard of hearing children. In other words, problems relating to the relationships these children have with others the same age. This is important because we see links between deaf and hard of hearing children with problems in this area and self-harming behaviours. Therefore, this becomes an urgent area of concern for deaf and hard of hearing children. Finally, the reasons for higher prevalence among deaf and hard of hearing children remain unclear. We do know, however, that it is not a simple case of children automatically encountering socio-emotional problems because they are unable to hear. The true reasons are far more complex. We believe that other factors and problems are also at play, including delayed identification of children as deaf or hard of hearing, delay in provision of interventions, mild delays in establishing relationships between parents and children, language delay, language deprivation, and various others. This range of factors affecting socio-emotional problems for deaf and hard of hearing children present a more complex picture for those wishing to identify definite causes for this disparity in prevalence. We do not know a great deal about the Irish situation in relation to socio-emotional problems among deaf and hard of hearing children. Very few studies had been done, and none at all had been carried out on a national level, looking at numbers of deaf and hard of hearing children having socio-emotional problems. What was available was data taken from the Growing Up in Ireland research. This data was taken from a major longitudinal research study that began in the 1990s. The researchers followed the same cohort of children over many years, meeting them regularly and tracking outcomes for the cohort. In this study of hearing children, we can evaluate their socio-emotional development and skills. And so, we have a set of data linked to hearing children in Ireland. Thus, we have figures for prevalence among hearing Irish children of these problems, roughly 11 to 15%. We've already talked about the international literature showing an approximate rate for deaf and hard of hearing children of 35 to 40%. So we can see a quite noticeable disparity. So now to talk about how we went about our research for this study. This was a quantitative piece of research, meaning that rather than in-depth interviews focusing on participants' experiences or how they felt, the focus was instead on figures. How many children were having these problems? Where were they? Background information about them, and so on. For this kind of research, the key is getting data on as large numbers as possible, so we can make general observations about what's happening in this area for deaf and hard of hearing children. We used an online survey to carry out the research. For parents and teachers of deaf and hard of hearing children to fill out. The idea was for parents and teachers to each respond about the same child, so that when parents completed the survey about their own child and had given permission for contact, researchers would then contact the child's teacher, who would then also do the survey in relation to the same child. In this way, the perspective of parent and teacher in relation to the same child were captured. The study participants were selected using a non-random sample, so it was open to anyone who was interested in participating. A general call for participants was put out to those who had a child between the ages of 4 and 17. In this way, the survey didn't use a limited random sample. The call for parents to participate began in February 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic was just beginning. And a call for teachers to be involved went out a little later, in June of 2020. So how did we find out about socio-emotional problems in the research? Well, we used a survey known as the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, created by a researcher named Goodman. I'll give you a minute to have a look at this sample of an SDQ from Goodman's research. So this Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, or SDQ, was developed by Goodman in 1997 and is a very well-known instrument for assessing socio-emotional development. And there are a few reasons why it's widely used. First, it's easy and quick to fill in for teachers or parents. Just 25 questions rather than a lengthy survey to fill in. So the fact that it's so widely used in international research also means that we can compare Irish results with those from other countries and measure responses to the same questions more easily. Another advantage is the 5 subscales it uses in relation to socio-emotional development: emotional, behavioral, hyperactivity, peer problems, and pro-social. This means while the first 4 look at potentially negative problem areas, the final subscale focuses on positives, the skills the child has. The survey is used by first having it completed, then summing the responses up to get a total difficulty score, or a TDS, with a maximum score of 40. I'll show you now how this works. So the maximum TDS is 40, meaning the maximum number of problems being present. And using scores from surveys completed out of this 40-point max score enables us to categorize the children in question into groups and allows us to make comparisons between where their problems lie compared to other groups of children. It means we can see if deaf and hard of hearing children have the same kinds of problems or more or less than other children, and by how much. The first group of children we categorized were those we labeled normal, who scored a TDS of 0 to 13, scoring comparably to their peers and not having many problems. Then we had the borderline category, scoring between 14 and 16 TDS, indicating that some problems were present. Finally, we had the category we labeled as abnormal. These were the children that scored a TDS of 17 to 40, meaning they had more problems compared to their peers. And I'm very aware here, by the way, that the terms used like normal, abnormal are problematic. I don't like those terms being used here. However, they are used because it's important for me to make clear the links to the exact categories used in Goodman's research and indicating the same number ranges that he used. Using Goodman's labels ensures that internationally researchers will understand the categories we have followed, that normal indicates a TDS of 0 to 13, for example. It's important to follow the terminology that Goodman uses. So apologies for this usage, which I'm aware has negative connotations, but that's why it's there. So we know from the literature that the categories of borderline and abnormal, taken together, are clinically significant, which means that children in those groups will often experience problems with mental health, so real life serious problems for children in those groups. So the survey is a good way to identify children who will need to be provided with interventions and other services. So this study involved deaf and hard of hearing children aged between 4 and 17 years old. There were a total of 113 children altogether, a good sufficient number to work with for the research. The children came from all around the country, from 23 out of the 26 counties, so again a good geographical spread. The average age of the children was 10 years old. 52% were male and 48% female, so in that sense it was balanced. 67% were in mainstream schools, and 40% of the children were noted by parents as having an additional need. So these children were not just deaf, but were said to have other needs on top of that. And 40% would be the average for this element of the deaf and hard of hearing population. So what results did we get? Well, from a total of 113 deaf and hard of hearing children, we saw that 58% were in the normal category of TDS scores, meaning that the majority of children were in the normal range. The borderline category represented 14% of these deaf and hard of hearing children, and 28% were in the abnormal range. So summing up the final two categories, we can see that 42% of deaf and hard of hearing children in Ireland have socio-emotional problems. So if we compare this to data from hearing children from the Growing Up Ireland research, we can see only 15% of hearing children have these difficulties. So this reveals a very high prevalence of socio-emotional problems among deaf and hard of hearing children compared to hearing children. It's interesting to compare those results from parent surveys to the results then that come from the teacher surveys, which show some differences. So according to teachers, 75% of the children fell into normal category, with 12.3% in the borderline and a further 12.3% in the abnormal category. This means that according to teachers, the sum of the second and third categories, the children who had socio-emotional difficulties, was 24.6%. So we can see that teachers are seeing these socio-emotional problems less than parents are. And that's an interesting finding from the study, which we'll talk more about later. In summary then, what does the study tell us? Well, first of all, that there's a high rate of socio-emotional problems among deaf and hard of hearing children in Ireland compared to their hearing peers. And we can see a considerable difference in prevalence rates between the two, which corresponds with the findings from international research. This evidence confirms feelings many would have had prior to the research about the presence of such difficulties for deaf and hard of hearing children based on observations. But it's positive now that we have such evidence of the issue, that Irish deaf and hard of hearing children have socio-emotional difficulties, 42% according to parents and roughly 25% according to teachers. And it's clear that parents are seeing these difficulties more than teachers are. It may be that they are over-identifying socio-emotional problems or that teachers are under-identifying them. We don't know, but we can see there are very different perspectives at play here. So what do the results mean? Well, now that we could show evidence of a higher rate of socio-emotional problems, it means that we need to proactively plan around delivery of interventions and services for deaf and hard of hearing children, and attempt to address and reduce these issues as early as possible. Another significant finding from the study was the differing perspectives of parent and teacher on the same child. And that impacts on our ability to identify and address mental health difficulties for deaf and hard of hearing children. If, for example, psychologists working with deaf and hard of hearing children attempting to identify such difficulties, they may provide parents and teachers with a very similar survey to the SDQ about the same child, but then may not know how to proceed given the very different perspectives of the child that they receive from parent and from teacher. So thus it's important to add to this research and use international studies to help us find out what's going on and why these different perspectives are arising. My study tried to find out why these different pictures emerge, but the results are not yet clear. And you can read about the findings in more detail in the research itself, which will be published soon. But the short answer is that we still don't know why this difference in perspective between parent and teacher exists. Now, maybe some of you have been thinking, why would you not also ask the child themselves? And we're going to talk about that right now. Because it's a crucial question. So whatever about parents and teachers, why is the child not included in this research? Well, for myself, this research represents a first step towards knowing the rate of prevalence, with the SDQ being our route to that. So the SDQ is an English language instrument that can be filled in on paper or online, but we don't have an ISL version of it yet. There's an American Sign Language version and a British Sign Language version, but not yet Irish Sign Language, which meant that we couldn't use it for this study. But the great news is that we've received funding to have the SDQ translated into ISL, and we'll be researching and working on that over the summer. Hopefully that means that soon we can put out a call to deaf and hard of hearing people to complete a test survey to see if the translated SDQ works well for this research. So that'll be the next step, and hopefully it means we'll find out more about deaf and hard of hearing children's own perspectives on themselves, their own difficulties, and indeed their own skills in this area. If you'd like to know more, the first research report, dealing with the responses of parents, is available to view or download online. The second report will also be launched soon. and it focuses on findings from teachers' responses and tries to answer the question why their perspective is different from that of parents. It's being printed at the moment, but let me know if you'd like an advanced look for yourselves. So hopefully there will be some time now for questions and answers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the presentation, for the recording. Yes, we have some time for question and answer. If you want, you can ask the question and Gemma will interpret, or you can write in the chat. Does anybody have any question? Robert Smith.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to put my hand up.
Yeah, that's okay.
Excellent, excellent talk. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. I've loads of questions, but I'm going to focus just on one, and that is, you mentioned that 40% of the children who took place in the study had additional needs, and it was identified that 42% of students had socio-emotional problems. Are those two figures related to each other in any way, or can you go back and track that based on the surveys?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I will say that this is a very large study, and we've published 2 reports out of it so far. The first report looked at the prevalence rate and comparing it with the Growing Up in Ireland research. The second report looked at those teacher prevalence rates and comparing them with parents. Our subsequent reports that we're planning are going to go more in depth on looking at those relationships and correlations. But from the initial analysis that we've done, Robert, yes, there is an association between presence of additional disability. And in particular, we asked in the survey, is there a previous history of social emotional problems? So for example, has this child been identified with a mental health problem? Are they on a waiting list for CAMHS? And that's the CAMHS, it's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. So we asked a number of questions that would give us an indication as to whether or not there is an identified problem in mental health for these children already. And there is an association between those children having higher scores, but they don't explain all of the scores. There are certainly a lot of children within that 42% who have difficulties, who don't have an additional need or a previous history of mental health difficulties, but there is an association between the two. But watch this space. There'll be more analysis on that at a later stage. I think a data set of this size, it actually became a bit overwhelming at one stage, how much data we have and how much information we can get through. So we were taking these research questions sort of one stage at a time, and that would be the next big project for us to tackle.
Excellent work. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Robert.
I have another question here for you, Elizabeth. Were there any differences noted between children attending deaf schools or mainstream schools?
Heidi, yes, I think that's another one that's similar to Robert's question. We did some initial analysis on this, but it doesn't feature in either of those reports that we have published to date. We did collect data from children about where their educational placement was, and I think about 65 to 70% of our respondents are in mainstream schools. Just give me, actually, no, I'll not. I'll have a look for that later and I'll contact you separately, Heidi, if I find a definitive answer to this. But it is something that we collected information on. As far as I can recollect from our initial analysis on this, which we haven't published yet, there isn't a strong association between educational placement and their SDQ scores. So we see this problem area showing up across all school settings. There isn't a very clear pattern for us from my recollection, but I'll have to present again at a later seminar because I think a lot of people are interested in this association between those background variables and prevalence and the presence of social emotional difficulties.
Thank you. The next question is, do you know of any other international studies that have asked both teachers and parents? And did any of them find the same differences in responses?
Hi, Gillian. That's a really great question. And there's a lot of international evidence that uses the SDQ, both in studies with deaf children and in studies with hearing children. And this pattern of differences between parent and teacher perspectives is very well established. So much so that there was quite a recent systematic review on this where they said, look, we have established that this is a pattern. We don't need more research showing us that there's a pattern. We now need to try and find the underlying reasons for this disparity, which I tried to do in that second report. We ran a couple of statistical models to see if we could identify the reason for those differences in opinions, but nothing was coming out strongly enough in our model for us to be able to say this is a contributing factor. What I will say, and it's quite interesting, if you look at the Growing Up in Ireland study, both the parents' rate and the teachers' rate is 15%. So when you look at what parents have said, 15% of children have borderline or abnormal scores. When you look at the teacher rate, it's 15% as well, which would make you think that they have similar perspectives. But actually, when you look at who they think have difficulties, the parents and the teachers aren't in agreement. So while their rates are the same, they view different children as being the children who have those difficulties. So yes, in short, Gillian, there's a lot of evidence to show that there are disparities between parents and teacher reports. I'm going to add one final comment to that because it's quite important, and it's from our own study, that while there is quite a gap between the parent prevalence rate and the teacher prevalence rate, there's very strong agreement between parent and teacher scoring patterns. It's just that parents are scoring a little bit higher than teachers all the time. So they're identifying similar children as being the children who are in that risk category. But it seems that parents are maybe scoring a little bit more highly, or teachers are scoring a little bit more low than parents are. But in general, there is an agreement pattern between the two that's a little bit difficult to explain, and it's kind of a statistical analysis process. But even though there is a gap between those prevalence rates, there is general agreement between parents and teachers on who the problem children are, or who the children with problems are. I hope that's clear.
Thank you. There are a couple of comments. One is from Dr. John Bosco Konama. I'm having some technical difficulties watching the presentation, so I could not participate fully, but I'm comfortable with the idea of using the clinical gaze on deaf children without questioning the monitor's own assumptions.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. You know, I think, and John Bosco will be familiar with my other research, and this is quite a divergence, and it's quite quantitative for me. But part of the reason why I think this study is important is that when a clinician, usually a hearing professional like a psychologist or a psychiatrist, when they sit down to diagnose, and I'm using that very medical term for a reason, when they sit down to diagnose social emotional problems in deaf children, they often lift out an instrument like the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire and give it to parents and teachers. So I think it's important to know what that measure is saying about deaf children in Ireland, how valid it might be, and then the next step of work that we're doing to look at deaf people's own perspectives. So you're shifting that clinical gaze away and allowing deaf people to have their input on what's happening. So I fully appreciate that comment, and thank you for making it, because I think it's a really important thing to raise, and something that sometimes goes under the radar with these more medical studies, that we just presume that this is all an objective measure, and it's not.
Thank you, Elizabeth, again. We have another comment from Nora Dugan. So not really a question, but more of a comment. Fascinating research and impressive data collection of 113 children. would love to look more into the data itself, but as you said, a disadvantage with this type of quantitative research is that it's limited in terms of identifying different factors that may contribute to lower socio-emotional development. The identification are also subjective. So wondering there is a way to identify the correlation between various linguistic and social factors and the child's socio-emotional development?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, Nora. Thank you. And there is some work that has been done in international studies that look at this as well. But I've mentioned already that that next stage of analysis that we're going to do is looking at those background variables. And we used a couple of background measures with the parents and with teachers, where we asked them to give their impression on a child's language abilities. So we've got some sort of measure of language, and we're going to now have a look to see, well, does language skill influence socio-emotional development scores? So we have gathered quite a volume of background variables that we're now going to start to run some correlation analyses on to see, okay, do these align with problems in social emotional development? But if I go back to your earlier point as well about that disadvantage of quantitative research, and it really is, you know, you get so much more in-depth material from a qualitative study. But one of the reasons why we've used the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire is that even though it's very quantitative, and even though it's a really short measure with only 25 questions on it that you give to parents or teachers, it has been shown to be really, really robust when you compare it with really in-depth clinical findings. So for example, there has been a study done, and I forget the name of the author now, I apologize, I don't have that detail on the tip of my tongue, but where they've administered the SDQ to a large number of young people, and then they've had those young people assessed by a psychiatrist with a clinical assessment. And the clinical assessment, which is that very in-depth qualitative type of assessment, aligns really closely with the SDQ results. So it's a really strong predictor for children and young people having what I call real life problems. So it's not just on this survey, but when you meet them as a professional and a clinician and you assess them in a very in-depth and detailed way, the children who have high problem scores on the SDQ are the same children that clinicians will say, yes, these children have depression, have anxiety, have behavioural difficulties, for example. So it's a really robust measure in that way.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Any more questions? You can even ask your question in ISL.
These have been great questions, by the way. It's brilliant because this is the first time to get to present this data in front of people, because I haven't been at a conference in a long time. So it's great to have the opportunity to think about the data and how other people will view the study and what they would like to see from the next phases of analysis.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think.
You share the slide and references, please. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And both of those reports, the first report is available publicly online. And I should say, I forgot to put this in the presentation, that this study has been part funded by Chime. So to thank them as the funders. So it's available publicly online. If you Google my name and social emotional development, you should find it. And the second one is going to be online in the next couple of weeks. So everything will be publicly available.
Thank you. There is one more question from Robert.
Only if it's an easy one.
I'll try to keep it easy. I wasn't going to ask because I'm assuming you have lots of ideas, but this idea of comparing the parents' answers versus the teachers' answers, do you have a little hypothesis going around the back of your head that maybe it's that teachers have exposure to a greater range of children than the parents do? And how might you measure? How would you measure that? How are you and what your plan is? It's an easy one.
Okay, so it's a really difficult question. So yeah, I have a couple of hypotheses for what could be happening here, and we tested this in the study using a statistical process called multiple linear regression modeling. Sorry to the interpreter. And we put a number of variables in to see that we thought would be associated, and none of them were associated. Now that's not to say that they're not the cause. It's just to say that statistically we couldn't show that they were a reason. And that might be down to the small numbers that we have in this study comparatively. So like 113 is a good sample. But then when we went to the teachers, we got 73 back. So that reduces our number. And then we've got a couple of variables we're looking at. So just because we couldn't show it statistically doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But hypotheses that I have, the first one is, and we see this internationally, that parents tend to be more aware of the internalized difficulties that children may have. So children who have maybe difficulties with peer problems and emotions, they're internalized problems. Those who have difficulties with behavior and hyperactivity, those are externalized problems. So parents tend to be more aware of those internalized problems. So if you have a child who doesn't really have any external problems like hyperactivity or behavior problems, but actually they're very anxious, they really worry about their friendships, those children are more apparent as having problems to their parents than to their teachers. Teachers are very quick at identifying children with externalizing difficulties because they create problems in the classroom, to put it quite bluntly. Like children who are hyperactive or children who have behavioral difficulties will get the attention of their teacher quite quickly. Another reason is that parents are often very much in tune with, say, financial difficulties that might be going on in the home and all of these other potential causes for socio-emotional development. So things that may be stressors for children, parents are more in tune with. So they may be looking more for the impact of these issues on their children, whereas teachers might not know about those things going on in the background and therefore are not looking for problems in the children when they're presenting in their classroom. I hadn't thought about the suggestion that you've made, which is that parents only have their own children, whereas teachers have large volumes of children that they know, and they may have a point of comparison to say, well, actually, no, that child is doing okay because this child has lots of problems. So they may have a different perspective on what is a normal amount of socio-emotional difficulties to have. So there are lots of things that can be going on there. I'm really interested to try and find out a little bit more about this. I don't know if we'll be able to get any more answers from the current study, but hopefully other international researchers will delve into this a little bit further.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there are, we're going to take 5 minutes before the next speaker. So Elizabeth, thank you very much for your presentation. Let's get back at 7 o'clock. Again, Elizabeth, thank you for your presentation, for coming tonight.
Thank you, Lucia. And can I just extend my apologies to Isabel, our next speaker, because I have to leave at 7 o'clock. It's the toddler's bedtime here, and I've promised that I'll be available. So my apologies that I have to leave now, and I really wish you all the best of luck with the rest of the seminar tonight, and I hope to attend more seminars in future. Thank you.
Thank you. See you in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Now we are going ahead with the second speaker, Dr. Isabel Eyrick. Dr. Isabel Eyrick is currently a lecturer at the Center for Deaf Studies in Trinity College. Her area of expertise is sign language interpreting, and her research is situated on the intersection of linguistics, intercultural studies, and language ideologies. She holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Leuven, Belgium, which was the first doctoral study to explore which linguistic interpreting strategies Flemish, deaf, and hearing sign language interpreter use and why. Additionally, she regularly organizes continuous professional development workshops for sign language interpreters. Isabel is an active volunteer within the sign language interpreting community. She is the secretary of the World Association of Sign Language Interpreter, WASLI, and the vice president of Tenuto, an organization offering continuous professional development for sign language interpreters in Belgium. The title of her presentation for tonight is The Strategic Nature of Sign Language Interpreting. So this presentation introduces sign language interpreting as a cognitive activity, looking at the mental processes and in particular the linguistic decisions sign language interpreters make. These linguistic interpreting strategies appear to be an intrinsic characteristic of sign language interpreting. The research findings suggest that 1, interpreting is strategic in nature. 2, interpreters make linguistic decisions which can be situated on a continuum of consciousness. 3, the linguistic decisions are motivated in terms of process and/or product-oriented goals. And 4, some choices are influenced by professional and personal ideologies. So now we can watch Isabel's presentation, and then we move on with question and answer at the end.
Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be a part of this network seminar series, and also very happy to be one of the first speakers in what will be a very inspiring series, I'm sure. As you notice, I'm addressing you in spoken English. So for today, I've chosen to present in spoken English instead of a signed language because my ISL, I've only moved here under 1 year now, and ISL is still heavily influenced by VGT and by international sign. So I know it's a privilege for me to be able to have this choice. But I do understand you accept my choice of language. Also, just to say that during the Q&A, I'm happy to receive questions in ISL and respond in ISL or international sign or VGT if there would be any, or spoken English, of course. So today I want to talk to you about the strategic nature of signed language interpreting, and thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and thank you to the interpreters as well working today. So this research was based on my doctoral project, which was funded by the KU Leuven, so that's the university in Belgium. And before I dive into what the topic was, I first kind of want to talk a little bit about myself as a researcher and how my specific profile kind of informed and influenced the research decisions I made, the perspective I bring to the research, but also how it kind of influences the way I present my results. So first of all, I'm a researcher. So one of my goals is to do research in order to increase our knowledge about interpreting. So I really focus on the field of interpreting studies. But as I'm a linguist, a trained linguist, always have this side of applied linguistics within. My PhD was also in applied linguistics, not in interpreting studies. Now, being a researcher, but also being a sign language interpreter and an interpreter, it means I've also been a research participant throughout the years. So I've been a professional sign language interpreter for over 15 years now. So within my career, I've been asked to be part of a research or to participate in research. So I kind of know how it feels like as a sign language interpreter to participate in research, what kind your expectations are, why you would be supporting research, but also what might be your reservations to being a part of a research. So I kind of was able to bring in that into my research design. Now, being a sign language interpreter myself, it also means I have insider status within the community of sign language interpreters. But as a researcher, you don't always want to have that insider status. It's good because you have some knowledge there of the community, of the struggles, of the networks and everything. But it can also be a disadvantage when you're doing, for instance, as I did, certain interviews, and you really want to have the perspective of your participants, but they know that there's a lot of shared knowledge between you two because you're an insider as well. And they sometimes will respond saying like, oh, but you know this because you're an interpreter yourself. So then sometimes you have to challenge your own insider status and present your little self more as an outsider and go like, well, I still would like to know your view on this. So this is something I definitely brought into this research, this insider-outsider kind of balance. I'm hearing, which obviously has a huge impact on how I do research, what kind of questions I think are important, which might be completely different if I were a deaf person. I'm a new signer, so I learned Flemish Sign Language, the first sign language I learned when I was 19, with the aim of doing research. So I was going to do my master's thesis on sign language acquisition at the time. I don't have any deaf relatives, so no deaf parents or siblings, so I'm not related to deaf people. As I said, I'm a trained linguist, I'm a trained interpreter, I'm an educator, so I teach interpreter students. I also teach linguistics. And that has very much informed my research because it's mostly those things I'm frustrated with and I'm having a tough time explaining to students, or I can see students need more knowledge in order to understand it. That's kind of where I'm coming from with my research, to kind of fill that gap. I'm also a practice searcher, so I'm a researcher who actually does research on the practice she does herself, so interpreting. I'm an advocate, which very much informs my research as well. I want to increase our knowledge on sign language interpreting. I want to increase awareness. I want to enhance our profession. I want to advance our profession. And I do that in many different capacities, one of those being a researcher. And then finally, I'm a white cisgender female from Europe, which I think within the field of interpreting studies, being a female is an advantage. Within academia, not so much, I would say. Being European means I have access to a lot of countries, access to a lot of languages. Mobility is not a restriction. Being white also brings along privileges in terms of access to certain groups, in terms of access to education. So I am very much aware that this profile also has an impact on the fact that I can do research and where I can do research and with whom I can do research. So bearing this profile in mind, while we talk about, or while I walk you through how I did this research and what my angle was, it also means we need to bear in mind the perspectives that are lacking from this research. And there are many that are not included in this research. And I do hope that other people who have the appropriate profile to do those studies will pick up on that in the future. So now the topic of the study I want to talk about today was the topic of my doctoral thesis. So it's interpreting, sign language interpreting. And just to frame the study, I'm going to give you the theoretical framework I kind of worked with and how I approach interpreting. So first of all, I very much believe interpreting is a goal-oriented activity, hence the strategies I will be talking about. So as an interpreter, you have a goal and you try to achieve that. Now, that being said, it's also important to understand that interpreting is a situated action, which means interpreting never occurs in a vacuum. It always occurs within a social construction, within an action where different interactants and different partners have different aims they want to achieve, different agendas they bring to the table. As an interpreter, you're part of that. And then, of course, interpreting is a social phenomenon. We could say a political phenomenon in some cases, institutionalized, as de Mulder and Howland have pointed out. So that's also very much important to keep in mind when we're doing interpreting studies. Why is the interpreter there? Why was the interpreter requested? Who requested the interpreter? Who made it possible for the interpreter to be there? And what does that mean in terms of expectations towards the interpreter, and how does the interpreter deal with those expectations? So these are things I very much took into account in my research. And then finally, but I would say most importantly, one of my aims with this particular research was to give a central role to the interpreter, to give the interpreters room and space to talk about their own work and to explain what they were doing, why they were doing what they were doing. So I take that from translation studies, where in 1990, Hatim and Mason criticized the field for not taking heed of the interpreter's perspective enough. And they asked for the field to return the interpreter to the central role of investigation. Now, on the topic, so my doctoral research was about linguistic interpreting strategies. First of all, I wanted to understand what an interpreting strategy is, what a linguistic interpreting strategy is. So I wanted to come up with a definition. And then the main question was, do signed language interpreters use linguistic interpreting strategies? And when I talk about interpreters, I mean all interpreters in the field, deaf, hearing, L1, L2. So everybody who considers themselves as interpreters are included in this research. Obviously, my hypothesis was that, yes, signed language interpreters use linguistic interpreting strategies. And this was influenced by me, my profile, myself being an interpreter, knowing I use these strategies, anecdotally talking about it with colleagues, and then also trying to teach students these strategies. So I kind of assumed the answer there would be yes. And that led me then to go on and ask the following questions. Which linguistic interpreting strategies do interpreters use? When do they use them? How do they use them? Is there any uniformity amongst interpreters in terms of the strategies we use and when we use them? But also why? Why do interpreters use strategies on a global level, so generally speaking, but also why do we use certain strategies at certain times in certain interpreting assignments? So that would be more locally. This is just a slide to show you that when it comes to the concept of an interpreting strategy, there has been quite some work in translation studies and in spoken language interpreting studies, but not so much in signed language interpreting studies. Also within signed language interpreting studies, the term strategy was not always used or is not always used. There is like various terminology used to kind of talk about the same thing. There was also mostly studies that would limit themselves and only look at one or two specific strategies. So I kind of wanted to close that gap, I guess, by taking a much broader approach, not predefining which strategies I would look at, but just let the data speak for itself. So as I said, one of the main goals was to come up with a definition. My starting point here was a definition that is taken from translation studies. So this definition has been put forward by Zabal Beskoa. And what is important from this definition and has informed my approach is that he says that a strategy is a specific pattern or behavior that can be aimed at solving a problem or at attaining a goal. So he makes that distinction. Either there's a problem or the interpreter has a goal. So that ties into the goal-oriented activity interpreting is. Now, he does say that a strategy needs to be a conscious action of the interpreter. And that's an important takeaway. And then the last thing he says was really key to me in my research. He kind of tells us how we can study or cannot study these strategies. And he says, basically, you can't just look at the source text and then look at the target text and decide where were strategies or which strategies was used, because you're not looking at the interpreting process. And strategies occur within the process. They don't occur in the product. The result can be observed in the product, but how an interpreter or translator got to that result needs to be studied by bringing the interpreter or translator in your research. And that is, of course, what I did. And I will explain to you later how I did that. So this kind of informed my approach and kind of was in the background of my theoretical framework while I was trying to define what a linguistic interpreting strategy is for sign language interpreting, but also applicable to spoken language. Most researchers say that strategies can be oriented towards the product or the process of interpreting. They can be problem solving or routines, and they can be global and local. And these are things I will also return to. Now, the next slide will show you the definition I came up with after my research and based on the literature I reviewed, of course. So we'll give you a minute to just read that definition. And I'll go to the next slide that kind of takes out the key concepts there of this strategy and makes it a little bit easier to process the definition. So first of all, I want to make clear that when I talk about linguistic interpreting strategies, I'm talking about strategies that are used or that occur during the interpretation. So when the interpreter is actually interpreting. So I'm not looking at preparation strategies, debriefing strategies, none of those, only what happens during the interpretation. And they are linguistic. So that means I'm not looking at strategies for asking for clarification, asking for repetition, using notes, using materials, asking your colleague to support you. None of those. So really only the linguistic strategies within the interpreting assignment. So for my definition, what is important, the first thing is that strategies occur when an interpreter has a choice and the interpreter is aware that there is a choice. So there can be many ways of interpreting one word or one sign or one sentence or one phrase. And as an interpreter, you're aware of the choices you have, and you know you have to make a choice, basically. And then that making of a choice results in you rejecting certain strategies and applying one strategy. So if you have 3 ways of interpreting one particular word or one particular sign, it means you will reject 2 of those ways and you will go with one. So that one is your applied strategy. Those strategies can be local when it just goes on the level of the text and the discourse, but they can also be global. So you can have like an overall aim with your interpretation, and that would be a global strategy, like adhering to professional codes of conduct, or aiming to provide the full information in your interpretation, or having a more meaning-based approach. Those would be like global strategies. So the interpreter's aim, there has to be an aim. That is why I think interpreting is strategic and is goal-oriented. And then we see that strategies can be triggered by something in the source text or in the process or the audience. So there can be a certain trigger. Other scholars would would use the word problem there, but I wanted a more positive approach to strategies and not talk about problems, but talk about triggers. And there needs to be a motivation. So the interpreter needs to be able to explain why they did what they did. And that, of course, leads to, there needs to be a degree of consciousness. If the interpreter was completely unaware that they did something, we should not consider it as a strategy. And then from my research, I found that strategies can be oriented towards the process of interpretation, the product, so the interpreted text, the target text, but also to both at the same time. So one strategy could be used as a process and product-oriented motivation. Now, probably of interest to you is to know how I conducted this research. There we go. Hope you can see this. So I had 8 interpreters included in this research. 4 of them had sign language as an L1, and of those 4, 2 were deaf and 2 were hearing. And the other 4 had sign language as an L2, and again, 2 were deaf and 2 were hearing. So 8 in total, 4 deaf, 4 hearing, but differing status of L1s and L2s. For the deaf interpreters, the source text was displayed on an auto cue, so they could see the text, and then they did the interpretation, which was filmed by a camera and a webcam, as you can see on the drawing. And then for the hearing interpreters, they received the source text through audio. There were 2 deaf people present during the interpretation task. And again, everything was filmed with a camera and a webcam. Now, the research design entailed several steps. The first was that all 8 interpreters got the same text. They all got 1 hour to prepare this interpretation. So they could just work for 1 hour on the text, use anything they wanted. And while they were doing that, they were asked to perform a TAP, T-A-P, Think Aloud protocol, which means when you're doing a task, you just say or sign anything that comes to mind. So any thoughts you have, you say them or sign them out loud. And this was recorded. This was to capture if already in the preparation phase, interpreters were considering strategies or not. So when the TAP was done, after 1 hour, the interpreter would do the actual interpretation, which again was filmed, and then come immediately back to me. I was not present during the interpretation. Come back to me, and then we would have a look at the interpretation together. So this is the task review. And during the task review, the interpreter had full control of stopping and playing the video whenever they wanted to share something with me, when they wanted to tell me like, oh, here I see I did this, or yes, here I know I did this, or here I actually wanted to do such and such, but I did something different. So this was recorded as well. After the task review, I went back to the target text and the source text, and I compared those linguistically, seeing what happened between the two. And those findings were then tied back again to the task review. So seeing what did the interpreter say, and going back to the target and the source text to see what happened there and tie that together. And if I saw that something between the source and the target text had happened, but was not mentioned by the interpreter during the task review, I would go back to the TAP and see if maybe they made a comment about that during their preparation. So this was the whole cycle of the analysis, and that led to the following results in terms of strategies. So as you can see, I made a distinction between strategies being applied and strategies being rejected, which is not really a categorization that has been used before in translation or interpreting studies. Mostly strategies are only considered what happened. But because I was really going into the process of the interpretation or the interpreting process, I could see that in order to come to an applied strategy, some strategies were rejected at times. So I made this distinction. And you can see within the applied strategies group, there are 10. Within the rejected strategies group, there are 5. Now, just to say, so in total 11, and some of them are used as rejected and also as applied strategies, interestingly enough. But just to say here that obviously this list is not exhaustive, because the first analysis of the data brought about 23 strategies. But at some point, I kind of had to set a mark of, okay, which strategies are we going to include in the full analysis, and 24 would have been too much. So it was decided that those strategies that were commented on by 4 or more interpreters would be fully analyzed. So the 11 strategies were mentioned by 4 or more interpreters as either an applied or a rejected strategy. So not an exhaustive list. There are many other strategies out there that are being used. Also, as you can see, there are more applied strategies than rejected strategies, but that is because my research primarily was focused on what the interpreters did, because the literature did not really give me a reason to look also at what they did not do. But during the interviews, they actually shared a lot about, oh, first I was thinking about maybe using this strategy, but then I decided not to. So this is why this category came into focus, but also why there are less strategies there. And as you can see, rejected strategies can be applied strategies, and applied strategies can be rejected strategies. It just depends on the context and when they are being used or not. So just for a good measure, I will go over the strategies that were identified in this research. So there's additions, substitutions, omissions, constructed action, paraphrase, repair, repetition, manual simultaneous construction, compression, fingerspelling, and literal interpretation. So there are 3 sign language specific strategies there: constructed action, fingerspelling, and manual simultaneous constructions. The others are just like general interpreting strategies. Now, if you want more definition of these 11 strategies, you can find those in my dissertation, but also on my blog, and I will share that website with you at the end of this presentation. So this is just an example of one linguistic interpreting strategy, addition. And here you also have the picture of how I did my analysis. This was done through Elan. So in the source text, it was said in Dutch, of course, physical disability. And some of the interpreters decided to interpret this as body, shortcoming, handicap. And I will just show you how this looked in Flemish Sign Language. And this was classified as the strategy addition because the sign handicap was added there. It was not in the source text. Now, I was very much interested in knowing why interpreters used certain strategies and why they rejected some strategies. And in the literature, people would talk about problems, choices, and also a motivation of product or process oriented. So I kind of tried to work with those categories in my analysis. But in the end, I landed on triggers and motivations. So what was defined as problem and choice in my research is captured by one word, trigger. So I decided to go with triggers, as I said, because I didn't want a problem-oriented definition of strategy. I think a strategy is a very positive tool, and it can be triggered. It can be triggered by something in the source text, but it doesn't always have to be a problem. And it can be triggered by something in the interpreting process when you're lagging behind or you're having trouble to keep up, or maybe you interpreted something in a certain way and then you feel that was not like the perfect way you could do it, so you decide to repair that. So that's the strategy, repair. So that's within your own process, but obviously there can also be back channel feedback from the audience, nodding, which kind of would tell you that you're doing a good job, and you might decide to keep on using the strategies you were using, or maybe a more doubtful look of the audience going like, I didn't really get that. And that might trigger you to start using different strategies or to actually start using strategies. So there can be triggers, but there's always motivation. You remember in the definition, it was a prerequisite. The interpreter needs to be able to tell or to explain why they did what they did. So motivation was always there. And the motivation, as I discovered, could be directed towards the product, so the interpretation itself, the text, but also the audience. So for instance, a product-oriented motivation might be using addition to make the text more clear for the audience, or using a certain substitution because you feel that is aesthetically a better sign, right? So you're doing something to enhance the product for the audience or just for the sake of the linguistic value of your interpretation. Motivation can be directed towards the process, of course, if you don't want to lag behind, or if you're catching up, or if you just want to take a breather. You could go for an omission, you could go for a compression, just reducing the information there. And then some of the strategies had the motivation to address both at the same time, process and product. So this, a trigger and a motivation can lead to an interpreting strategy, or just motivation can also lead to an interpreting strategy. And this is kind of like the conclusion or the summary of my dissertation, and I can talk about many, many other things, but that would take double the time, if not triple. But this is kind of how it works when we look at linguistic interpreting strategies. So we have a certain motivation, which can be a global motivation or a local motivation. And that makes the interpreter consider using an interpreting strategy. But before the strategy is actually applied, there are some strategies, or maybe one strategy, that is being rejected and then again is influenced by a certain motivation. There's a certain reason why the interpreter is not using specific strategies. And then after some strategies are rejected, there's another motivation leading the interpreter to the actual strategy they used, and that's the applied interpreting strategy. And then it kind of like starts all over again. So this really happens in seconds, right, within the simultaneous interpreting process. And also what's very important to understand here is that this all interacts with each other. So the strategy I'm choosing now is going to dictate or influence my next strategy, and that's going to influence my next strategy. So they're very much interacting with each other all of the time. So it's not a static process, it's very dynamic and it's influencing each other. So I've actually already come to the end of this presentation now, and I hope I'm within my 20 minutes, probably not. And I know it was just like a surface kind of overview. I could talk much more about which kind of motivations, which kind of strategies, etc. But I think this is a nice first introduction. So to summarize, my hypothesis now is that interpreting, and it doesn't really matter if it's signed language interpreting or spoken language interpreting, interpreting is fundamentally strategic in nature. We have seen that interpreters are presented with linguistic choices. We see that interpreters make decisions. So interpreting is a decision-making process. And we see that some of these decisions actually are very conscious, so they are strategic. And these strategies then again are motivated. So this is very important to know. It's very important also to take this within education of interpreters, but it's also very important to take this to the people who work with interpreters, like deaf people who work with interpreters, that they are aware that interpreters will make choices all of the time, and to have like an open conversation about that, like which decisions, which choices, and how do we come to an agreement on that the choices the interpreter is making is actually in line with what the deaf and the hearing people who are working with the interpreter want or expect. And then one other thing, and that is something I did explore a little bit more in my postdoctoral research, is the influence of ideologies. And I'm just going to briefly say what that was about, and then I will end this. So what I saw during my PhD was that sometimes the motivation of interpreters to use or not use certain strategy was ideologically motivated. So the values and the beliefs they had about deaf people, about deafness, about sign language, about spoken language, also about the profession of interpreters, seeing interpreters as knowledge holders, knowledge creators, gatekeepers. It did influence their linguistic decisions. So this is something I explored more in my postdoc, and I can do another presentation about that at some other time. But for now, I will thank you, and I will also direct you to my blog, where you can find blogs and vlogs in both different written languages and in different signed languages about my PhD, but also about my postdoc and all things strategy and interpreting. So thank you so much. And I am very much looking forward to your questions and the discussions we can have about this.
Thank you, Isabel, for the amazing presentation. I can see already some hands up. Romy?
I'm just going to ask my question through ISL, if that's okay. So I just want to say congratulations. I loved your presentation. It was great. And I have read through your PhD as well, because that was also linked to some research that I had undertaken myself. So I think it was a great opportunity to see your presentation again. But I do have a question, just especially about the interpreting strategies, because I think that this is really, really very interesting. When you were talking about VGT or Flemish, the interpreters and the addition, the example that you had there, and they had added an extra word into their interpretation of that. So kind of recently, I've been thinking about the strategy of addition, and also thinking about that I think it might be a natural strategy, I suppose, some people take within the sign language. So I just want to know kind of what your opinion is on that. Maybe a little bit more. Great, thank you so much for your question. That's a great question. So while I was presenting my PhD research, the committee did ask similar questions in that, and talking about strategies and what might be more natural, might be the natural way in the signed language, and that might be a natural thing that happens within the language. So for example, we talk about if the interpreter is aware of that addition or aware that they're making that decision, then that might be a strategy that they're using in that moment. And also, I mean, was it a decision that they made, or and when we were talking about the thinking aloud process, that we did in the preparation, the thinking aloud protocol that they used preparing that, so you have to think about if that was a strategy that they had planned or talked about in that, maybe while preparing before the interpretation, or was that something that they decided to do as they were signing or as they were interpreting? So I think that is the difference there in I suppose that awareness of consciously making that decision to make an addition or not. And Marissa, thank you so much for that answer. I loved your presentation. And your thesis is also great as well. I also read that. Thank you.
Thank you, Romy. Any more questions? You can sign, or you can type, or you can ask directly. Nora, Nora Dugan.
Hi there, thank you so much. Your presentation was brilliant, it was very interesting. And I'd love to know more about the ideologies. I think that was a really interesting part as well. So I'm looking forward to see what comes in the future from the research. So I'm just in thinking about deaf interpreters and hearing interpreters. And I'm just wondering, did you notice a difference in the strategies that were used between deaf and hearing, or did you notice some similarities? Yeah, great. Thank you so much. That's a great question also. So I know in my research, I hypothesized and that we kind of really wanted to look and see what were the universal kind of strategies, and if there's any kind of uniformity in the way between hearing interpreters work and deaf interpreters work. So unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to go into detail about every part. So now I can explain a bit more, which is great. So interestingly, we saw the same for spoken language interpreters. We saw there was a lot of variation in the strategies used. So we saw that there was some variation in the strategies picked by the spoken language interpreters. So the different interpreters would choose different strategies maybe for the same text. So then it was very interesting as well to look at, obviously during COVID, we were talking about the education piece. I think that's a big important part. So the 4 deaf interpreters that were involved in the research, so one had finished a master's degree in interpreting, but the other 3 had not, hadn't got any training. And then in terms of the hearing interpreters, all 4 had finished their training, their education training. So those 3 interpreters that didn't have any official training, and then we had 6 interpreters who did. So that was kind of a bigger number involved in the study that did have the training. So I think we really wanted to see the impact of the training on that. So the deaf interpreters were more, I suppose, they obviously had their own perspectives that they had brought into their interpreting works. We really found that education did make a huge impact on the strategies and then the way that they worked. I suppose there was a big difference between the deaf interpreters and the hearing interpreters. So the deaf people were sometimes able to relate more with the experience as they were interpreting, and so they were more focused on the audience and who their audience was, whereas we felt the hearing interpreters were more focused on the actual product itself, on the text itself. So it was that was one difference that we did notice between the 2 groups. And that's great. That's so interesting to note the impact that the interpreters' education had on their interpreting strategies they use. Thank you so much for answering that. Thank you. And as well, just adding, and just one other thing maybe to notice, I think it's very important. One very important thing is the interpreter's education. I suppose we're very lucky that obviously the PhD and all the research that has been set up. So I think we're very lucky with the standard of education we have for interpreters here in Ireland. So I think that's also very important to note that we're lucky to have that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any more questions? I can see we're getting close to the time. Any more question for Isabel? Okay. Thank you, Isabel, for your amazing presentation and for coming tonight. Okay, sorry, I'm just checking if there are more questions in the chat. No. They're just saying thank you for the presentation, great presentation. And I would like to thank you everybody for coming tonight, for attending our first seminar of many. I would like to say thank you to the interpreters, Gemma Shannon and Cormac Leonard, for the amazing work. And yes, watch this space and we will organize more seminars in the future. Thanks again, everybody, for coming.